Hello again everyone, you're tuned in to WRPG Radio. It's like you can't get enough of this stuff, huh? If you're following along to the Grimdawn Newcomer's Guide, this is video 3 in the series and we'll be talking about a lot of things that happen when you get hit. The previous 2 videos in this series were all about doing the hitting, so if you haven't watched those yet, give them a look. You'll probably find something in there you didn't already know about, or maybe you'll have a laugh. More than likely, you'll end up with some deep-seated genetically coded dread in the periphery of your vision at the very least. Defensive stats are a completely different being of unfathomable complexity and design. All those silly equations that convert damage types pale in comparison to the staggering amount of numbers that go into calculating armor for physical damage reduction. We'll talk about that in a bit though, since it doesn't do me much good to liquefy everyone's brains right at the start. Especially given that I still haven't found my bendy straw. In order to understand defensive stats in Grim Dawn, you have to understand offensive stats, so do yourself a favor and check out both the videos on damage that came out before this one. Once you're all caught up, you can start to make more sense of everything we're about to break open here. I'll be showing you 3 of the tankiest builds I've ever crafted throughout the video as well, so you can watch all the different ways that being a bulldozer covered in cement is a viable strategy for dealing with the endless forces of demonic invaders. You'll also want to understand the order of defense, which I'm going to try to lay out as plainly as possible right now, so buckle up, the video has begun. So, as far as the order of defense goes, first, enemies are going to have to get through your dodge, deflect, and fumble chance. Dodge and deflect are your chances to avoid melee and ranged attacks, while fumble is your enemy's chance to completely whiff attacks. Second is the calculation between enemies' offensive ability to your defensive ability. Does that attack even land? Third is your shield application, so if you don't have a shield this won't matter, but if you do, we'll talk about the shield stats specifically at the end of the video. Fourth is the reduction of damage from certain enemy types like Chthonians, Ethereals, humans, beasts, etc. Fifth will be the application of your resistances. Sixth will be the application of your armor. Seventh will be the percent reduction of the enemy's damage. And 8th will be the percent damage absorption. Finally, number 9 is the remaining flat damage absorption. You can think of these last 2 as working in the way that a shield works in something like a MOBA, not to be confused with the piece of gear that is the shield that you'll oftentimes be wearing. Now, to make things extra complicated for the sake of this video, we're not going to talk about these things in the order of defense. We're going to talk about them in terms of their complexity and when you'll start massing them for the game. Certain things like armor have a lot of details to go over, so they're going to be further down in the video, whereas easy stuff like resistances is just going to come right off the top. With that being said though, we've got to talk about the simplest defensive stat in the entire game. Number 1 is your health bar. You know that thing that makes the screen flash red when you're not doing so great? It's that gauge with a couple thousand numbers on it that makes you stop playing when it hits 0. It might sound redundant, but trust me when I say that little red bar is your first and last line of defense. In Grim Dawn, your health bar can be affected by a multitude of factors, so we're going to go straight down the menu like a planet killer headed directly for our atmosphere. Physique is the first major contributor to the health bar and is available to start dumping points into all the way from the start at level 2. For every point that goes into physique, you're going to get 2.5 bonus health, a very small amount of health regeneration, and half a point of defensive ability. Don't confuse that 1 point of physique with the attribute point that you put in yourself every time you level up though. The attribute point that you allocate will give you 8 physique, which means 20 bonus health, a slightly larger but still small amount of health regen, and 4 defensive ability. You can see how that number will start to stack up dramatically the more that you jump into it. Since we're already on the subject of physique, remember that this attribute will also dictate certain types of gear that you can equip. If you're trying to build tanky but have all your points in spirit, then you're going to have trouble equipping big heavy gear with all your super useful magical aptitude. All three of the base attributes will give you bonus health, but physique is going to give you the most, while cunning and spirit only give you 1 per point. The next stat that is going to affect your health directly is the increased healing stat. This one in particular is pretty rare in terms of how often you'll find it, and that's because it will only ever increase abilities that heal your character. Since the use case is pretty limited, the gear options are pretty limited as well. Essentially, healing increase is a % increase that gets applied to your healing abilities, bumping their output by the amount that they list. This kind of stat is really great for builds with built-in heal buttons like Pneumatic Burst on the Nightblade, Blood of Dreeg for the Occultist, or Word of Renewal on the Inquisitor. These abilities also apply to your pets if you're looking at a pet build, so investing in this kind of stat can be the deciding factor on keeping them alive. After we talk about healing increase, we've got to talk about our health regeneration. Health regen is one of those sleeper stats in Grim Dawn that is really important, but you might not realize that until the point that you don't have enough. For context, one of the tankiest builds I've made, which is my Lifesteal Witchblade tank, that's a soldier plus occultist for all the uncultured among you. At level 97, this class has 14k health, and it has 3088 health regen per second. By comparison, the level 61 ranged paladin I'm working on has 10k health with 190 health regen. The melee class between these two needs to have a lot of regen because his whole personality is standing in the middle of all the bad guys and getting hit. It's basically Flats versus SpongeBob. In contrast, when the paladin gets hit, he has to run screaming away, trying to kite while his health regen tries to exit sloth mode. Also, don't forget that your health regeneration increases are only going to affect what's on your gear and devotion, while the base health regen that comes with physique will not be increased by this stat. No matter what your plan is for dealing damage, having enough health regen means that you'll be able to recover from those big hits that don't flat out kill you, because if you can't do that, you'll have to rely on the next stat, which is Constitution. I'll be honest, Constitution isn't something that I have almost ever paid attention to, which is bad because the times that I am paying attention to it, I'm running and hiding, waiting for it to kick in while I'm being chased into oblivion by the biggest, fattest meanie in the place. This is the hazy yellow overlay sitting on your health bar that seems to shift from time to time. When you take damage and you don't have enough health regen to heal up, Constitution will kick in once you're out of combat. Unfortunately, this can take a bit because aggro range is absurd on certain enemies. Once you're out though, you'll see the yellow bar deplete while your red bar regens quickly. Once the yellow bar runs out, you won't regen health out of combat until you talk to one of the food vendors or find a refill out in the world. This one feels like it's much more effective in the early levels, but never underestimate the effectiveness of Constitution when you're in an emergency. When it comes to health, you can get flat health bonuses and % health bonuses from gear, devotions, and augments. % health bonuses are a jackpot for builds that want to use high health as a baseline, but flat health bonuses are necessary to get the maximum yield from those % bonuses. Health is the single most important stat in the game, so do yourself a favor and don't ignore it. But now we have to move on to one more easy defensive stat to talk about before invoking the wrath of the armor equation. The good news is that most of what we've got to talk about is all based around the damage types that we covered in the first video, so you should all be all sorts of ready for this, right? The second set of defensive stats are your resistances. There are actually a ton of these, but the ones that you're going to see most often relate to your core damage types. These are your fire, cold, and lightning resistances, which can also be collectively obtained as elemental resistance. Remember, when you have elemental res, you're getting equal parts of all three for whatever value is shown on the gear piece. After that, you've got poison and acid resistance, which is the only one that spells out that it covers the damage and duration damage component. That being said, each of these resistances applies to the duration counterpart as well, unless there isn't a duration counterpart, such as the case with Aether, Chaos, and Piercing damage. Bleeding damage also has its own resistance, but it's the only singular duration damage without an instant counterpart. This accounts for all the core damage types in the form of resistance, but there is one more damage type that sits with the rest of them at a significantly lower cap. Physical resistance isn't actually a resistance for physical damage in Grim Dawn. Stopping physical damage is exclusively the purview of the armor stat. Physical resistance is your resistance to internal trauma damage. Like we mentioned in the first video of this series, internal trauma damage is the damage over time component to physical damage. This damage type has a cutoff of 40% instead of 80%, and even considering that, you might not even end up getting this maxed out. In fact, the amount of physical resist that you'll come across in the game is very limited and will often only be single digits. There are some set bonuses that offer anywhere from 10 to 15% physical resistance, but they're a heavy commitment for that stat. In most circumstances, you may end up only having 30% physical resistance, which isn't bad by any means. With the way that Phys works and the enemies that deal this type of damage, you'll want to keep stocked up on it for big fights, but generally speaking, smaller enemies won't have as much of this to make anyone worried. Remember, once you're in Ultimate though, every enemy is scary, and if you're randomly killed while having insane defensive stats, make sure you know how much physical resistance you've got during the post-mortem. The other thing that's special about physical resistance is that this one is not going to be reduced when entering higher difficulties. Now remember, when you enter the elite difficulty, you're going to take a penalty to resistance, which reduces the amount of fire, cold, lightning, and acid damage resistance that you have. Each of these drops by 25% and will go down another 25% in Ultimate. You'll also lose 25% resistance to piercing, bleeding, aether, and chaos in Ultimate. You won't lose any amount of physical resistance or stun resistance though when going up in difficulty. That being said though, these are your core resistances, and you should think of them as absolutely necessary when you're planning on taking a build into Ultimate. Even when going to Elite, you're really going to want to have at least the top row maxed out because those penalties hurt. After your core resistances are done though, you'll be making your way over to page 3 of your stats, where they hide all the weird stuff that you never think about. On this page, you're going to see disruption resistance just below your stun resist. If you haven't figured it out by now, stun resist is just the shortening of the duration of a stun that has hit you. Disruption resistance, by comparison, is all about your ability to prevent enemies' abilities from interrupting yours. The status itself will basically stop you from casting an ability and put your abilities on a short cooldown. That is disruption to say. This is especially horrifying when you're standing in a pool of damage that constantly reapplies the status every time it damages you. Builds that rely heavily on casting will want to have a lot of disruption resist or outright avoid enemies that can disrupt you. After disruption resistance, you'll see that we have to talk about life leech resistance. This resist is the secret one that gets penalized when you go into Ultimate. All the way back here on the third page, your life leech resist drops by 25%. This resist is the one that won't necessarily break the bank on any build, but can become very useful in the right scenario. Essentially, life leech resist and its non-penalized energy counterpart are going to allow enemies that have lifesteal to steal more life from you. If you have a lot of life leech resist, they won't be able to steal as much, making their health bars effectively a lot more manageable. For instance, if you're in search of the Endless Menace Chupacabra, having a good chunk of life leech resist will prevent her from getting a lot of her health back when she hits you. This is particularly helpful for immobile builds that get stuck with eating a lot of hits like a plate of wet spaghetti. Energy leech resist works the same way, so if you're going heavy into ability span and run up on an emotional vampire, that green bar is going to drop fast without the right resistance. After these two, you've got Trap, Petrify, Freeze, and Sleep resistance. These are your big enemy CCs and will do a huge number on you. Like I mentioned in the previous video, CC can be a monolithic pain in the tentacle if you're not prepared for it. These resistances are going to limit the amount of time that you'll be CC'd for, with Freeze being the most predominant among them. There are a lot of cold-based enemies in the game, and there is at least one nemesis boss whose name rhymes with juice hockey that can near permanently freeze you. After those though, you have your slow resist, and it is exactly what it sounds like. This resist will help you resist the effects that slow your attack, cast, and movement speed. Another form of CC that you may or may not notice depending on how strong the slow is and how strong your resistance is to it. Reflect resist is actually really important for characters that have incredibly high damage. The reason for this is that there are a lot of reflective enemy heroes in the game that will have the reflect damage effect firing on all cylinders the moment that you arrive. If you're a Death Ray player, then you're going to feel the reflected damage right back at you, boring through your skull like an angry green laser from the sun. Obviously the green sun. Reflected damage hurts real bad, but at the end of it all, you don't have to attack the guy that's reflecting on you, so maybe you just wait patiently to strike instead of dumping heavy into reflect resist. Both are viable options, one is just a little bit more brain off. The time has finally come to talk about one of the most complicated defensive components in all of Grim Dawn, which is saying something because it's probably a stat that a lot of people take for granted for a very long time. Armor in Grim Dawn acts as a deterrent to physical damage. Armor is everywhere because everything in the game is going to do physical damage in one way or another. From your tiniest of enemies to the biggest, baddest bosses around, when you get punched, it's physical. So here's where the first bit of the armor conversation starts. When you highlight your armor rating in the stat screen, you'll notice that a bigger menu pops up showing you 6 body parts with a chance to hit, armor rating, and armor absorption column. Armor is individualized to each of these 6 body parts based on the armor that you're wearing in that slot. There is not just a big bucket of armor that you wear at all times protecting all of your special bits. In fact, the first column is going to tell you the likelihood of being hit in one of these sections. These numbers do not change. Your chest piece will typically be hit the most since your torso is pretty huge. You've also got a big chance to get hit in the legs because let's face it, those things are just basically another torso split in half despite how gruesome that imagery may be. After that, your head and shoulders have a slightly higher chance to be hit than your feet and arms. You can apply the logic that you need to make those chances make sense, but I feel like they're pretty spot on. Now the second column is where the actual stat that says armor on the gear comes into play. If a piece of gear has 10 armor, that number will be reflected in the second column. The armor rating is the amount of damage that your armor will absorb for you. If you get hit with a 10 damage attack in your head and your helmet has a 10 armor rating, congratulations, you've nullified that damage. That is to say, that would be the case if we didn't have to talk about the third column, which is armor absorption. This column is going to dictate how much of that armor rating is actually going to be used to offset the incoming damage. At a baseline, armor absorption is 70%, so that 10 damage that we just talked about, well, you'd actually only absorb 7 of it, and you'd get hit with the remaining 3 damage. The nice thing about both rating and absorption, though, is that both of these stats can be increased through gear, devotions, components, and augments. Your armor effectiveness will increase dramatically the more you invest in these stats. You'll come across gear and etc. that will increase your armor by a flat amount or a percentage. This is a good thing when it comes to getting hit by higher and higher amounts of physical damage. Remember that when you get hit with a physical attack, your armor is only going to prevent damage up to the amount listed on the gear. Any amount over that is not going to be affected by the armor at all. The same thing applies to absorption, which means that if you've only got 70% absorption, even though your armor rating might be 1000, your armor is only going to stop 700 damage. You're still going to eat 300, and then you're going to eat anything else that went over that 1000 as well. So basically, you've got a chance to be hit in one of 6 body parts, and once the game rolls where you're going to be hit, then it determines how much damage gets applied. Once the damage gets decided, you're going to figure out how much is going to get absorbed, and after the absorption, you'll find out how much damage you'll actually have to take. That's a lot of steps for something that happens instantaneously, so just remember that you want high armor and armor absorption if you are a melee character. You probably want it if you're playing range too, but your quick feet should help a bit more with that whole getting hit thing. But there you have it. That's the whole armor formula for getting hit by one type of damage and the single defensive stat that mitigates it. And now I need a nap. But I can't sleep yet because there is one last set of stats to talk about, and they all relate to how bad the guy that hits you is getting hit back. Imagine somebody punches a cactus and their hand is covered in cactus needles while they run and scream in circles. Oh, sweet music. This is the concept behind retaliation damage. Retaliation damage is very simple, but there are a lot of different flavors, just like regular damage. When you're deciding on whether or not you'd like to incorporate a lot of retaliation damage into your build, remember a few things. Number 1, these are their own stats. You'll need to find gear, devotions, abilities, and so on that say X type of retaliation damage in the details. Number 2, retaliation damage on its own cannot crit. When you are attacked, you'll do the damage back to the enemy, but that damage will never critically hit. Number 3 is a special stat that you'll find on gear and other things called retaliation damage added to attack. This is going to take the whole of your retaliation damage along with its buffs and shrink it down to whatever percentage is listed on that particular gear or ability and add that damage to your outgoing damage. Rata, as you might see it referred to, is meant to take passive ways of dealing damage and turn it into an offensive one. Number 4, when you are dealing retaliation damage, remember that you are dealing all of your retaliation damage at once. This means that if you're holding a lot of fire damage retaliation, but a little bit of acid damage retaliation also, you're going to be dealing them at the same time anyway. Lastly, number 5, retaliation damage goes through the same conversion process that your normal damage types do. If you have 100% of your fire damage converted to cold damage, you also have 100% of your fire damage retaliation converted to cold damage retaliation. This way of dealing damage heavily favors builds that can take a hit, and in a lot of ways makes playing defensively more rewarding. Builds that focus a lot on dealing retaliation damage also don't have to focus very hard on increasing their offensive ability because they don't need to worry about critical hits on damage that can't crit. We've made it to the end of the video, and there is one final block of stats to cover before we put a bow on this thing and leave it under the tree for the next unsuspecting victim. Now, if you don't want to use a shield in your build, you don't have to care about chance to block, damage blocked, or block recovery. If you want to be cool and use a shield though, these stats are going to track how often you block, how much you'll block, and how long it's going to take you for your next block to be ready. Now remember through the order of defense that your shield comes in pretty early and will take a pretty good chunk of damage off of your plate. The reason it applies so early is that the block chance is typically harder to stack up to high amounts, and your shield will also have a cooldown called block recovery once it takes a hit. This cooldown is usually pretty short, but still significant enough that you can't block every hit that you take. After your shield, but before in the order of defense, you've got your dodge and deflect chances. These are your chances to completely avoid either melee or ranged attacks. Since these are completely nullifying any damage that is going to be done, they are at a premium when it comes to stacking them on any build. They'll generally be found in the single-digit range. Getting a dodge and deflect chance over 20% should be considered above average because that's 1 in 5 attacks that don't even exist. Then finally, we need to talk about damage absorption, which comes in 2 types and occurs very last on the order of defense. Damage absorption, not to be confused with armor absorption, is going to work in a way similar to a shield in a game like League of Legends. You can use the Tortoise Devotion as an example for flat absorption. This ability is going to give your character a shield that will absorb a flat amount of damage when you are hit, but that hit will need to go all the way through the reductions of all of your other defenses before the pool of flat damage absorption is impacted. Meaning that if you've got 100 flat absorption and the enemy's 500 damage attack got reduced to 100 damage, this absorption is going to eat the entirety of that leftover hit. The other version of this, which takes place before the flat absorption and the order of defense is % damage absorption. You can use Ishtok the Spring Maiden as a devotion example. This skill will give you 25% damage absorption, so if that same 500 damage attacked got reduced to 100 before getting to this order of defense, you would only be taking 75 damage and passing that down to the next order. That might not sound like much with these small numbers, but instead of 100, let's say 10,000. Shrugging off 2,500 damage is no small feat. The way that these are ordered is specific so that the % damage can take out the biggest chunk of damage and that your flat damage absorption can take over what's left. Typically, flat is going to be smaller numbers because there should be a lot of percentage reductions to it before we get to that point. Welcome to the end of the video. You've made it all the way through video number 3 of the Grim Dawn Newcomer's Guide, so give yourself a pat on the back, and if your brains are still in one solid chunk, then don't pay any attention to the fact that I found my bendy straw. Don't worry though, there are still plenty of mechanics left in Grim Dawn to talk about, and I can imagine that we can soupify plenty of brains in the meantime. Thank you so much if you made it to this part in the video though. Feel free to let me know down in the comments below what you thought. If I missed any explanations of these stats, if I said something wrong, please let me know and I'll be happy to pin that comment so everybody can take a look. This is, after all, the Newcomer's Guide, and we want to make sure everybody who's new can know what they are talking about. That's it for me though. Thank you again for tuning into WRPG Radio, and kindly keep yourself glued to this station. I wouldn't want to have to chase all of you down.